Welcome to the 4D PNR's monthly layout tour. This time around, we have a person who really needs no introduction, the former superintendent of 4D, that's Bill Messecar, and he's going to talk to us today about building his layout and also looking toward taking it down, I think, as he's moving. Anyway, with that, Bill, take it
Great.
away.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Looking forward to going through this with you. It was such a joy building this layout, and it's been so much fun operating in it and the friendships that have formed. And it really had a huge impact on my model railroad journey. It's something that I've always wanted to do, but never had the space and time to do. And so when Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas, I was fortunate enough to come up here as part of the Donald Douglas marketing team and work for Boeing. And that was such a great experience. It was like selling Yugos and then moving up to selling, the most popular car there was. And I got a chance to meet my friend of 45 years who I had never met before, John Thompson. We had corresponded extensively. So that all led up to this point. So I still didn't have the room in the house that we bought, but 6 years later, we bought another house in the same area in order to move into a one-story property here in a development called Winterwood, just outside of Covington. And there was an empty basketball court there. And I thought, my basketball days are long over. So I thought, hey, I could build a building there. So I had room for a 24 by 28-foot space, and I wanted something single level. And John Thompson encouraged me to do a design that was basically like an E along the back with three long peninsulas, one against the wall that would have no duck under. It was going to be an HO because I had been building structures for quite a while. That was what I really enjoyed, and cars. So I had a lot of equipment ready. The layout was going to consist of three 20-foot peninsulas, well, two, and then one that was actually the full length of the structure along the back. 24 by 28 was the outside dimension, so it was more like 23 by 27. The theme was going to be citrus packing and protective service. And protective service means icing or other services to enable the citrus to travel, up to a week and still arrive fresh and in good shape, because that's how a citrus is sold by lot like this and moved to different destinations on the Midwest and the East Coast. And then it's sold, it's taken out of the car and put into a warehouse, and it's sold at auction. So it has to arrive looking in good shape. It's not sold in advance. It's sold, shippers ship to where they think it'll be sold. Anyway, the year was going to be this transition, and I wanted to have a passenger terminal. That was added a little bit later. But one of the interesting stories about getting this approved, I contacted a company in Tacoma that specialized in building garages. And I'd seen an ad, and they developed plans, and I wanted it to be approved by the city or county. And so an building inspector had to come out and check the setbacks from the property line. Well, there was sort of a little thing that indicated where that was, but I just laid out some stakes and put some string on there. And then when he came over and looked at where the building was relative to the property line, he said, okay, that's good. Had to be at least 5 feet. I think I set it 7 feet. It might not have been quite 7 feet, but it was pretty close. So he accepted he didn't look for and run his own lines. He just accepted the ones that I had. Anyway, here this shows the area of Southern California. The Santa Fe built from there to up over Cajon Pass to meet lines coming from the east, and that's another story. And in Southern California, in the LA basin, there were actually four divisions. The first division was the line you see in the upper right corner that ran from Barstow down to San Bernardino. There was a second division that ran along the foothills of the Sierra Madre Mountains, and there was quite a bit of citrus. You can see the orange color kind of indicates where there were concentrations of citrus. And one interesting story about the second district is there were very few communities there when this line was built. And so the railroad, wanting to establish business and sell the land, put stations at least every 5, 6 miles on this line. And you can see them there. There's many stations between Pasadena and San Bernardino, and all of these developed. They promoted citrus farming. Packing houses or packing facilities were developed relatively quickly. The third district, which is got a lower grade, that was the line that ran kind of along here and through Riverside, Corona, Placentia, which is near Anaheim. Now, it didn't actually run through Placentia, went down to Orange and then went back up, but they built a cutoff here early on to eliminate that. And then the fourth district ran from near Fullerton down to San Diego. So the third district was the one that I chose because it involved some passenger trains and all of the through freights and many fruit turns. And a turn, to remind everybody, is a train you generally send from one terminal out to stations, do whatever work is needed, and then return to that station. So they had many fruit turns that would involve one or two or three of these stations. So the first thing, I'm going to go through the building. I'll show you some scenes about the layout, talk about its operation. But I contacted the company, and the first thing they needed to do was to basically tear out about 3/4 of the concrete pad that was already there, because I wanted to make sure that the thing was perfectly level. I had a previous experience of building a layout in a garage, assuming it was level, and found out no, it wasn't. And it's built with a slope, which, like a dodo, I should have realized that. Anyway, this thing was built level. You can see it in mid construction. It was framed, and they put a header in the front of it, and then put wallboard over that, and it covered up the opening, which I didn't need. But someone else who might buy it and doesn't want to use it for that could, if they move some bushes and stuff, use it as another garage or get access for a large vehicle storage or something of that sort. So that building was started in February of 2005, less than a year after we moved into the property, and it was finished within 3 weeks. It was wired. That's another story. We were on vacation when the thing was completed, and we got home the day before the people that were going to do the wallboard were supposed to come and put that all up on the inside. And I discovered that the electrician had put all of the outlets at 48 inches, which is exactly the height that my layout was going to be. So I went into the areas that would be covered. You can see from looking at this in the back view and to the right, that would have covered up those. So I had to quickly pull the nails out, drag those down, and reinstall them so that the wallboard would. Anyway, one of them didn't quite work that perfect, but that was one of several problems that we had with the wiring. But basically, they did a great job with that. John came over and helped me paint that inside white, and they had sprayed the ceiling, and we painted the walls. And then I made probably the smartest decision, one of the smartest decisions that I made, which was I had a handyman who was very good carpenter, and I contracted with him to build the bench work, and he came and installed all that. So the installed stuff is in the upper left and far right photo. The photo in the far left shows you what it looked like after we began putting risers in, and we had painted the backdrop, and I'll show you that process. John Thompson also helped me with that. So one of the things that I also did, which was to recruit some people, several of whom Bill James and John are on this call, to come over and help do that work and schedule some regular work sessions. And they were wonderfully helpful, and we had a great time building this thing. So here's another picture a little further along. I used a particle board that was left over from the building. When they finished building the garage itself, they had about 5 sheets of this 5/8 inch particle board. They said, "Well, we can dispose of that for you if you want." I said, "Oh, no, 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 I want to use it." So I ripped that on a table saw, then a skill saw to cut out the curves, and bought sheets of Homosote from Dunn Lumber, and had someone else cut all that and notched it. He had a little system for doing that. So all the curves, you see one right in front of you in the left picture where I'm laying the first piece of track that turned out to be in the slightly wrong location, but there I was. This is in November after we built the thing in February and had the bench work up by June. We had the risers and subgrade and roadbed down in 5 months. So I'm laying the first piece of track right after Thanksgiving, and you can see the roadbed. That system using the Homosode worked great, and it cost about a quarter of what Homobed would cost. I curved it by hand with a sharp knife, and that all worked fine. The only thing I had to do was to take a sealer like you'd use for laying track. In this case, it was white mud. Basically, spread that down so that it covered up the notches in the curved Homosode pieces so that the ballast wouldn't fall through the floor. There's some other shots. This is in Corona. You can see what that track work and layout looked like. And this is probably about a year after the building was built. There's a picture of John in the upper left helping me paint the backdrop. I found a color that I liked. It matched some photos from Southern California and got paint store to match that. And then I painted the entire thing with a roller. And then John went in. We had a lighter color mixed with white and put that on and then brushed the margin between them to make this blend that you see. So later on, somebody else painted clouds on that, but that was our initial take on the backdrop. The other thing on the photo on the right, one of the things I planned from the beginning was I wanted to get out all my rolling stock kits and engines that had been in these tubs for the past 10, 15 years. So I knew what I had and what I needed to build and what was already built. So you see the edge of one of those in the far right photo. I went to IKEA and I got 3 of them, and that was really smart. I think Burr will tell you that because I got out all my stuff and put it on the shelves, and I knew what I had and what I needed to finish and what I didn't have. So plan ahead, and you can find your stuff.
Hey, Bill,
Yeah.
you tell the story of the door swinging in instead of out?
Yeah. So when I originally drew the layout plan, I had sort of assumed that it would be an outward swinging door, and I had spaced these 3 peninsulas, each 32 inches apart in the drawing, and that was what the guy built. Well, when they actually got to building it, he said, "Oh no, you can't. It has to, by code, swing in." So I had to move that peninsula you see in the far right corner, which is against the door, which is just past the bookcase, Placentia, the town of Placentia there. I had to move that in, so I had to sacrifice an inch or two in spacing between these. It hasn't been a big problem. 36 inches would be nicer, but that's just wider than I could build it. You can see some of I'm laying out the track in the bottom there with the paper. I think a lot of people do that now, use the paper, a copy of the turnouts from the NMRA site to do my spacing for the yard. And the yard was going to represent both ends of the layout. So the yard you see on the lower left corner, the middle to edge facing the aisle represented the eastern end of the layout, and the yard from the middle to the against the backdrop represented Los Angeles. So there are 2 lines that go out, and that track that I was laying, this piece has 2 tracks. The one on the left against the backdrop leads to Los Angeles. The one on the right would lead to San Bernardino. And you can see some of the track drops and the bus wire, which ran through holes in the bench work, color coded, and we soldered, again, we had a lot of help doing that, soldered those track drops in, and then wrapped them onto the bus wire, and that has worked fine. I have never had a problem with those. So once we got the track work in and tested, plugged it in, and it worked. So DCC is so simple. I use the MRC, which is the simplest system, I think. And initially, it was a plug-in throttle, but as soon as the radio throttles were available, we switched over that. So when we were laying the plaster, you'll notice some plastic sheeting. I would put that over the backdrop to keep some of the plaster off if you can't keep it all off. Now, here's one mistake that we made. I put in all that track work and I actually ballasted a lot of track before we put the plaster in. and then I put tape on it to prevent the wet plaster from dripping onto and getting into the ballast in the track. That did not work perfectly. So I spent a lot of time trying to clean that out, and it would have been much better to wait until all the plaster scenery was in and colored, and then ballast the track. So I think that'll be a lesson learned later. Anyway, here's Bill James working on Placentia. You'll notice how hard he's working, and of course, John over on the right is looking at the camera. So John is working over in Riverside, and he's working on scenery there using Woodland Scenics scenery materials. So this went pretty quickly. Here's some other guys that helped. And this was really the story of this layout. I had such a wonderful crew that would come over every 6 to 8 weeks and spend several hours plus lunch. And then in the afternoon, and we'd accomplish a great deal. So in the upper left, we're working on laying the hydrocal. All this was on hydrocal with paper towels wet over rolled paper, no taping, just formed it. And that worked most of the time. On occasion when we got a landform we didn't like, you just kind of punch it out and redo it. So it wasn't a big problem. Down in the lower left is my good friend Don Hubbard, who John introduced me to, and he was a very faithful worker as well. And then Ned was a Santa Fe fan, and his son lived up here. He lived in Portland, so he would come up for our work days and work on the scenery on the track. And then on the lower right is a young man that I found through an art teacher that was in our church. And I was talking to her one day about wanting somebody to paint clouds. And she said, I've got a great art student. And I think he was 16. He couldn't drive yet. His mom would drive him over. Anyway, we agreed on a price. He came over, worked a couple hours. I paid him $25 a visit, took 5 visits, and he painted the clouds on all of the backdrop. It took him, I think, 5 trips, and he used sponges to do the whole thing, and they really look nice. He's probably in his late 20s now. That was quite a few years ago. Here's now I painted once we got the plaster base down, I painted it kind of a tan color. You can sort of see it on the edge by the fascia. And then we put down layers of woodland scenic materials and sprayed them and put rock and trees and shrubs. And so it was kind of layers. So this is Riverside, which was the first town west of San Bernardino. And then you can see the San Bernardino Yard or the San Bernardino LA Yard. One of the changes I made from the original design was I added a track there were several. I added the LAUPT, the passenger terminal, along the back of the layout room on a suggestion for Bill James. Another good reason to have helpers is a lot of people see things you don't see the way you see them. And I was looking for a place because before that we'd put one passenger train and put it in the middle of the freight yard and then run it and take it off the layout. So this way I had a dedicated yard, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But that came after the fact. So there were a number of things that we've added. Once you started operating, you find that this design didn't work quite as well as you'd hope. One of the benefits of modeling the prototype, though, is that the track plan generally is pretty good, or the layout of the railroad wouldn't have it that way. So I've tried to follow their track plan when I could. Here's at the other end of Riverside. This is the structure I built from a kit. In fact, the only kit I know that's got a full-size packing house. This is 1-to-1. Most of them are too big to be modeled in this space. I had to actually bend the siding there to get behind it because it took up quite a bit of space. But that structure, the original burned down in early 2000 in Riverside, but it was just over 100 years old, and it was a wonderful kit. Marty McGurk's wife ran that company, and you may occasionally find these available. I had another packing house there. This one's from a Clint Crow kit of a apple packing house, I think in Wenatchee, that was in brick, and he offered it in concrete, and it looks a little bit like McDermott Fruit Company, which also is burned down. I added if you notice this red looking thing, that's a cull bend, meaning when they grade the oranges, if they find cuts or bruises, they cull or pull that fruit out, and it's sent off, usually in a truck, to a location where they can turn it into orange juice, and then they sell the rind and other stuff for animal feed. So there's some other structures we added. My friend Don Hubbard built that Union Ice Company. I think that's an old Sitem kit. So you get a better idea of how the whole layout looks. You can see the shelving on the far left. The door is just out of sight to the left. So this is Corona, which is a town that had a branch line that ran instead of east-west, which was what the line from San Bernardino, LA did. There was a line that was built south to Lake Elsinore called the Elenor Branch. And there were several industries on that branch. And those are depicted here in the right-hand side of this segment. So this is a Walters kit that was used for a company that was Owens, Illinois company that have found a fine grain of sand to make for a glass, window glass, which they did in another location. So they shipped that out of there. That was just south of Corona. And then on the other side, there was a very large facility owned by 3M that produced roofing granules to put on top of roofs. Most of that couldn't be depicted here, but there's a small part of that facility. And my friend Don Hubbard built some of those buildings. And then at the end was or near the end was a company that produced drain pipe, bricks, and so on, called Pacific Clay Company. And when I first designed this track plan, these two tracks came down and there was no connection. And the first time I tried to operate here and pull a train out of here, there was no way to get behind the cars. So I quickly added a crossover here. So now when you bring those down, most of you have been over here and operated, you run down here and you use that as an escape to get behind those cars and then go around them and push them into the storage track. So, or the track over on this side. So that was a case of another one of those discoveries that only occurred after I started operating. Also Branch built this depot at Corona. That's pretty close to the prototype. Have a packing house over here called Corona Citrus that was from a kit that looks a little bit like that packing house. That packing house is now owned by Lucas Oil Company of Indiana and still exists, but of course it's not used as a packing house. And then there's a fine scale miniature structure here that I had about 6 of those, and I found a place for all those, even though they're not really prototyped for Southern California at all. And this is probably the crowning piece on the layout. In early 1900s, when Sunkist or California Fruit Exchange was being formed as an exchange, meaning a cooperative between all the fruit growers, they needed a place to process oranges and lemons in Southern California that were not going to be sold as boxed fruit. In other words, culls. So they selected Corona to be the location for the facility that would process lemons, and it was called Sunkist Lemon Exchange in Corona. And it closed maybe 25 years ago, and it was torn down. But the main part of it that did the loading, there was many buildings in here because they created frozen lemonade, they created citric acid. So they did research on lemon byproducts. That's how they came up with pectin used in canning. So I had done a plan for this building from the photos and from the space I had. And I'll mention something else that I did here. And I had one of the guys that was a regular worker there named Al Clements, a wonderful N-scale modeler who was interested in the Santa Fe but lived in Centralia, I think. And he asked if there was anything that I'd like to have built. And I yes, this one. And he took those plans, and about 3 months later, he brought this beautiful building over and we installed it. It's just magnificent. That's a Walters water tower there, but it was exactly the design of the one they had at Corona, and that would signal the shift. So anybody that lived in Corona would hear that, and it was like a timepiece. It went off when shift change was, and it was very much of a piece of the culture. One of the things I did after the track work was in, and before some of these buildings, such as this lemon exchange, was built, is they built a mock-up of the building out of thin cardboard, just constructed to see, and would find sometimes that it was a little too big, or I had to change the shape or something of the building to fit the available space. And I did it at that stage, revised the plans, and that really was a big help. And I left the mock-ups there until the building was built. That way, when we're operating, we began operating relatively early. Within 2 years, somebody could see where Corona Lemon Exchange was located. Here's some of the buildings on the Elsinore branch. This is the 3M facility on the right, and the Owens, Illinois at Porphyry on the left. It would get the sand. And then the Pacific Clay Company, they shipped mostly clay out of here to other locations that wanted this to make bricks and drain pipe and so on. They had a facility in Los Angeles where they would do that. And they had the ovens you see for doing the bricks. Here's a wide angle shot of Placentia and the line as it returns to the yard along the back. You can see it going west through here, and then it goes downhill. So there was a 2% grade, which was the grade through this area, introduced, leaving here, going through Riverside. Corona was the high point, and then it comes downhill, level here in Placentia mostly, and then downhill to return to the yard. The yard is at 48 inches, and Corona is about 3 inches higher than that. On the right, you can see my 3 shelving units that housed all the kits. And then you could see, of course, Placentia laid out there. There were a number of it was actually 6 packing houses in Placentia, and I only had space to model 3 of them. One of them is in this photo, which is Placentia Mutual Orange Association, PMOG, or Orange Group. And this part of the building was actually an office for the Mutual Orange Association, which was an association of growers that used Sunkist. You'll notice on the building, you'll see the signage there, Sunkist. And so I contacted Microscale Decals, and the manager happened to be a Santa Fe fan and a friend from my time in Southern California. And he took the artwork, or he took the stuff I sent him, and he had Microscale create a set of decals for packing houses, and that set is available today. So I used that set on all these buildings. Sunkist had changed their signage in the late 40s, early 50s, and so it was really helpful to have these accurate decals for these buildings. And of course, I made sure it had all the building names and the town names that I might possibly need. So there were 2 other packing houses that I modeled here. There was another one next to it, also packed for Sunkist, called Placentia Orange Growers Association, so POGA. And so one of the fun challenges here in operating the layout is to remember the difference between PMOG and POGA, because they're 2 different locations. And on occasion, people will get them confused, or they'll pull a reefer that's not supposed to be moved and not sure where to put it back. So, and then you can see one in the distance here. That's Bradford Brothers. And all of these are scratch built to maybe 2/3 the size of the original. The other thing I'd comment on, none of these buildings, there's a depot here that I also built, the Santa Fe Depot, but none of these buildings were here. And my friend Don Hubbard and I decided we were going to add these, and these are the buildings that were located there behind the depot and the edge of town in Placentia. So we scratch built this whole town scene probably 5 years ago, well after the completion of the layout, but went in and made that change and really enhances the look of that scene, I think. So here's a part of the yard. This is the sort of the west end of the yard. There's an engine facility there. You see a sand tower, and this sand tower was located in San Bernardino. It's from a kit that John Thompson had bought that was offered of the sand tower located in San Bernardino. So I built it for him with the premise that when I'm done with it, which I'll talk about in a minute, he'd get it back. So he's got a sand tower and a ramp and a drying tower with it that he'll get back. And I added some office buildings that were there. and a characteristic water tower, which is very much in evidence in Santa Fe engine facilities. And this is where I store the engines that we use in the operating sessions. So in the back, we put a cattle pen, and then later, my friend Don Hubbard added these to an ammonia facility and an LPG facility, which is located in San Bernardino, not quite in this spot, and then an interchange track on the far end with the Southern Pacific. It ended up that we created quite a few local industries within the San Bernardino Yard, enough so that that's a real operating session for a crew now, is doing the local yard job. And that was something that we added after the layout was completed. Here's another important building on the layout that's very characteristic of the icing facility. It's the Precooler. This was a large facility. Let me explain what pre-cooling involved. Shippers of citrus found that you get a much better, a more even distribution and a much more long-lasting icing if you pre-cooled the load before it was iced or as soon as it was delivered. So when it was picked in the field, it might be shipped that same evening. Those oranges are still going to be very warm, and the ice will cool them off, but not nearly as fast as this pre-cooler. And this pre-cooler had chillers in this building and then sent chilled air in the low 30s down pipes, and those pipes were attached to the open hatches on one side of the refrigerator car and an exit hatch on the other side, and it blew that cold air into these refrigerator cars, and within a couple hours lowered that temperature from probably the 70s down into the low 30s. And then that would be iced. You could ice it on the same platform, and that would do a much better job of protecting the fruit. And so, in fact, shippers had, in some cases, these portable chillers. They could actually pre-cool or a car or two themselves. But this was frequently something the shippers chose to do. And the SP had a similar facility up in wherever their big icing facility up is in Central California there. Yeah, Roseville, right. PFE was located there, and they had a huge pre-cooling facility like this one. This was also a later addition, the commissary, because when I added that track for storing passenger cars, I added this track for food service cars like lounges and diners. And we had a spot a car here for linens or canned goods or that sort of thing. So that's a commissary track there. Then I built later this chiller that was located there because someone published an article in the Santa Fe magazine that's got about 1,550 individual pieces of styrene in that, but it's not as hard as it looks. I used grooved siding and just put those in at a slant with plastic cement, and they stayed pretty well, and then put a strip in front of them. And so those are 4 sides, 2 long, 2 very short, and it ran that flexible pipe up there, and that sent that chilled water into the chilling facility. Here's the LAUPT. I didn't have a lot of shots of that, but that's a 12-inch wide shelf that was added off the end of the layout. And then we ran a track that had gone along here and ran and then fed these 4 tracks, which we use now to create what we store. And these buildings were located in the back of the Union Station in Los Angeles. This is an REA building. This is for express shipments on the railroad. Baggage is the next one, and then the post office facility for mail cars. So those types of cars are spotted there, and they're used on the fast mail trains that the Santa Fe brings in. And so that train runs one direction westbound through my layout. When it returned, it went via the second district, a different line. So we only run that one westbound. There's also I'll talk a little bit now about what the passenger trains are, but this added tremendously to the operation of the layout. So here's the layout operation that we now can do. Originally, we ran using car cards, but we now use a freight list, a switch list program called RR Ops. And it's a very intuitive, really excellent program. I know Russ Segner uses it. A number of modelers here in the area use it, which he's made available for free, and he does updates. It's a really good, great program. So we use that to run fruit turns. We run two through freights. Fruit turns would go from San Bernardino into these towns and return, but there was a little bit of freight, maybe 20%, maybe 15%, that actually moved west. For instance, some packing houses would ship into LA to put it on board a ship and ship it over to Japan or somewhere else, citrus by ship. So, and there were other materials where they needed to go to LA, like I mentioned, the clay and some other products. So there were through trains that were used to do local switching. Then, of course, there an eastbound train that would pick up empties and bring back empties from Hobart Yard, which was near in Los Angeles. So we run two through freights that will do local work. And then we have two passenger trains. The Grand Canyon ran this route, not the route of the premier trains, which were the Super Chief, El Cap, and Chief. They ran on the second district. And the San Bernardino Local, which ran in the early 50s until about 53 and then terminated, carrying people from San Bernardino and these communities into Los Angeles for work or shopping and returning at the end of the day. And then I mentioned the westbound fast mail that came from Chicago through Kansas City and other points, and it did a lot of business in the early 50s carrying magazines that were printed on the East Coast back then, and bagged sealed mail. So it wasn't a train where you did a lot of mail sorting. It was a train that carried bags of mail, express, freight shipments, and magazines. And then the yard industry switching I've already mentioned. So here's some photos talking about operations. The one on the upper left, you can see has boxes for car cards. So when we began operating on the layout back before 2010, I set that up to operate with car cards. And if you ran a turn, you'd receive a pack of cards and an engine card to run that turn. And then in 2016, we switched to freight lists. So the group on the right, which is a shot, I think from this year's Sound Rails group, is using the switch list program, our ops that I mentioned. Here are the three turns and the various through trains and so on that I talked about. Bruce's program generates train switch lists based on information you put in about the layout of your spots, how they're connected, whether they're in a yard, how they're organized. Industry bills, you have to create a bill that says this industry, let's say the Poga packing house needs empty refrigerator cars, or it needs a car with lumber to make boxes, which they did at 53, 54, or it needs a box of paper wrappers. You put all that in there and you put a little bit of a priority in terms of the frequency that they're going to need these cars. So packing houses needed a lot of cars frequently, not so many for ship lumber. And so you can influence the way it builds up the cars for a particular location. And you describe all the motive power you're going to use, and then you list the trains and where they stop and which direction they do work and what kind of work they do. Once you have that, you push a button, you generate a train. It's that simple. And it automatically keeps track of how many cars you have in a particular spot. So if you say, I can only put 2 cars at this industry, it won't send you 3 or 4. It will only send you, if you got one there and it's not going to move, it'll only send you one. So now we pre-stage the freights so that when the crews come in to operate, the freight trains that are run are all ready to go. And I talked about the local switch job. That's got about 8 or 9 different locations to do switching. Operating sessions typically will last 3 to 4 hours, and we could take up to 4 crews and run those 9 trains that include passenger trains and turns and through freights. 6 operators and 3 crews is easier because one of the keys for operating on my layout is I have to see who gets done first in order to know which train they should run next. Because if you've got people that are still busy doing local switching in a town, you can't send a through freight there to do local switching. You have to assign them something else. So I just watch to see which trains finish and then assign them other work based on what's cleared up. So some of the advantages, there's no car cards or waybills. You get this immediate train generation. You get a limit on the number in capacity. and it blocks in the sense of it knows to put together in its listing both cars that are going to one industry together with any cars that are being picked up at that industry. So you have all of that activity. What it does not do is if you have two industries on a spur or siding, it doesn't know that those two industries are next to each other, and it will not necessarily list the activities of those two industries next to each other. So when you're blocking the train based on the information, well, I'll show you what it looks like. Here's the way you get this list, and this list, you can see the first group just lists all the cars that are you'll need for the train, and here's the order. So I don't really pay much attention to this. This is the order of those cars. In this case, these 14 cars are going to go on a Placentia turn, and you can see that there's two cars going to feed, and then two cars going to Barnstead Lumber. If you go over to the second list here, you'll see that it lists Barnstead Lumber pickups, meaning it says Barnstead to train, but it doesn't say anything about feed to train. So there's nothing at the feed. Anyway, so that's how that list works. And then when you leave to return, because you go back to where you started with a turn, here are the cars you're taking back. So you're bringing quite a few more cars in here than you're taking back. But that's an example. It shows you automatically when you print a summary, like after an operating session, here's where every car should be. So I'll print that out and I'll go out on the layout, make sure all the cars got located in the right spot. And sometimes they don't, but you want to then locate them correctly or tell the program they're actually in a different spot. You could do that. And then you can edit trains. So if you don't want to use a particular car or you don't want it to do something that you can remove that and add other activities in there, override. Okay, we're getting close now. Lessons learned. Mentioned early on, made plans for storage of rolling stock and structure kits on the shelves so I could see what I had, what I needed to complete, what I didn't need. I'm in that phase now. But for the layout, I developed a 5-year plan and we stuck to it and we finished the layout in 5 years from when it was started in 2005. We were done. At least we had all the scenery in, structures in. We made lots of changes after that, but and then plan your resources so you've got like if you've got a group coming and you're going to lay track, you want to make sure you got plenty of track, you have plenty of wire, whatever it is you're going to do. And then a really important one. This was one that I used is trading money for time. When I had my friend build that bench work, we could have certainly done that bench work, but he had that up in about 6 or 8 weeks. And we had track laying going. I would have taken a year or more on regular work sessions. Anyway, recruiting helpers. We had that Santa Fe group that John and I had started locally here, and they were a great resource. Bill James and others that you saw in the picture, Don Hubbard, were big helpers out of that. And I tried to schedule regular work sessions for all the different activities, whether it was putting in track drops, laying track, putting in scenery, the hard shell stuff. That went pretty straightforward. I had plenty of hydrocal, and I think I bought 100 pounds, and I probably had 60 pounds left when I got done. And commit to a regular schedule. We had a regular schedule of work sessions. And then once we had the track in and everything was operating, if I didn't have a building or a mock up, I used little printed cards, little lettered cards. And we actually operated on the layout and got a lot of ideas about, well, track work that needed fixing, operations that didn't go quite the way we had planned. Of course, the other idea about this was something from this Model Railroad Hobbyist article, visit other layouts, operate on other layouts. You get a tremendous number of ideas from them. The idea for the operating system I got from using it on Russ Segner's layout, and could see how intuitive and straightforward it was. And I think my crew really likes using that because it's a lot more straightforward. So comes the exit part, which is the end. So my wife and I are going to sell this place and move to another place nearby because the property is more than we can handle at an acre lots of yard work, and we're getting too old for that. And the house is fine. It's one story. We moved here, in fact, to spend our later years here. So that means I'm going to have to take the layout down. And I've enjoyed it for 20 years. And so, no regrets. But I wanted to offer the structures that are on the layout. Some of them have been spoken for. The Corona Model River Club wants the Exchange Lemon thing. And I promised my son one of the buildings he saw me build at home. And some others, and then there's others like John's engine house and some others that he's loaned me to use until I no longer need them. So if you're interested, I will try to put out a notice on 24D that says, okay, this weekend or this month, we're going to have a open house. If you are interested in some, and they're free. You're welcome to take any structures. I'm not trying to sell anything. I just want to, if somebody wants to use it, fine, and we'll probably junk the rest. I don't expect I'm going to save any track, and I'm trying to sell as many engine cars in the interim as I can. But it's probably in the springtime and maybe early summer when this thing will finally happen. So with that, we're out of gas and I'm open to questions.
Well, thank you, Bill. This is Lee again. That is just an amazing presentation you just gave of sort of the cradle to grave of the layout. Found it extremely informative. So I'd like to open the floor up to questions if anybody has any.
I just want to say that I thoroughly have enjoyed operating on Bill's layout. It's a totally different conception scheme than mine. And so it sort of forces me to think differently, but it's a lot of fun.
Thanks, Rose.
Hey, Bill. This is Alex. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed following your layout over the years. And I was kind of sad to hear that you're going to be taking it down. But of course, the next logical question is, are you planning to build a new layout at your new house?
I don't think so. But I'll see if I've got some room maybe for a shelf layout, and I might consider that. But the kind of place we're talking about moving to is probably an area where there are relatively small yards, 1,500, 1,800 square foot houses, maybe, in a gated community or a community area. So I'm certainly not going to have room to build this building, and I don't have enough lifespan to start over with this. But I might end up doing a little switching layout. There was a nice one in Model Railroader just recently that got me interested. So, but there's a lot of great layouts around here to operate, and that's what all the guys that are on this call, and I enjoy helping and going to other people's layouts, but not likely, Alex.
Yeah.
So, Bill, I have a question. Are there any things like benefits or other things that occurred, really big picture things that you had not expected when you started your design and had your concept? There's some things that changed in the hobby that changed your approach, or
I was fortunate enough that I didn't, if I'd started all this in 1990, I would have had to, do DC and start all over. I started it and I joined PSMRE when we moved up here in 98. So I saw their DCC system and how well that worked. So I went to DCC right away and got a lot of engines converted. I made that decision. Just happened to luck out at the beginning there to add that. It wasn't from a technology standpoint. No, I don't think so. I had a friend offer to put signals in, and he had done that. I don't know if I would have done. People don't really pay much attention to that, but it's a nice feature. I like it. But I don't think so. The biggest change in the operational layout was the decision to add the passenger terminal off the back end of the yard. That really changed the operating scheme to the better, because before we had groups that were, they were basically operating in a town, and it was very hard to bring another freight train through there, and certainly couldn't do any other operations. They were gone. But now I've got a passenger train and a yard job. So there are other activities. So that's probably the biggest change, was the passenger terminal, and adding the industries at the yard job really changed the sequencing of how I have an operating session at the layout.
Let me add a couple other features that you haven't mentioned. One is you have a Y for turning your steam locomotives, And that was created because you also have a complete loop that you could run trains round and round for guests, but I don't think you've ever done that. I've never seen you do the round and round thing, but that round and round route created the Y where you can turn your steam locomotives because you don't have a turntable.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd mention is it's very convenient. You didn't have to build a separate staging yard for the ends of your layout because your freight yard doubles as a staging yard, and it
Yeah.
works very well. You can switch the freight yard to switch cars around to create trains, and then the trains sit there as stage trains. So it's a both a staging yard and a switching yard, which works well.
Yeah, that's a good comment, John. The latter part, that was part of the plan. I talked to some people about what's called open staging, where you use your yard. And I thought about, well, maybe I could, when I was originally designing the layout, put a partition so that Los Angeles would be visually and physically separated from San Bernardino, and then no, it's not going to work. I don't have enough space. So that was the intention from the very beginning, is to have that open staging and have most of the trains pre-staged. But you can actually, yeah, sure, use the yard for switching and do that. But and it was your idea about the why, and I have actually done that once or twice in open house, but you haven't been here to see it. But yeah, I have used it that way. And yes, for I use freight steam engines for a couple of the passenger trains and the freights, and that's where I turn them.
I'll give it another one now, which is it's very inconvenient when someone is switching a town to have a through freight come through and mess up their operation. So you carefully plan so that the farthest turn goes out first, and then the second furthest, and then the closest, so that each train in a separate aisle can be switching those towns without getting in each other's way. And also, the aisles are fairly narrow, so it's important to keep multiple people out of the same aisle at the same time.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I do sequence those. Although, yeah, the aisle is a constraint. The Corona has got enough tracks that you could have a train there, but it works easier. Yeah, we typically send out the turns in order of the farthest, next, and next, so that they can do the bulk of their work, and not have somebody coming through. But then, of course, we also have passenger trains and through freights. But yeah, the key is you've got to keep it so that you don't have two trains trying to switch this town at the same time. We avoid that most of the time.
I was just going to comment that it is amazing how much apparent research you have done into the industries and the operation of Santa Fe in that area. It's very impressive. And I was wondering if you had started that with a previous layout or somehow had an interest in Santa Fe before you ever began the layout here in Covington.
Oh yeah, my interest in the Santa Fe goes back to, well, we lived in Southern California in the late 60s and then moved to the East Coast. And I got involved with a guy who started what would eventually become prototype modeler, Bob Longo. But he started the Santa Fe specific group with a little mimeograph publication called High Iron. And I got very involved with that. And that's where I met John Thompson, who lived on the other end of the United States. I was in Connecticut. He was in. So for 25 years, I was very active and interested in Santa Fe prototype, everything, structures especially, but operation and so on. And the other big influence was when Keith Jordan and Richard Hendrickson, every prototype modeler knows Richard Hendrickson, who passed away 10 years ago, published this Santa Fe book on refrigerator cars. I got that and I read that cover to cover. And I still we were still traveling to Southern California. And there were all these packing houses showing up in that. And I thought, this is what I would be interested. That was what influenced me to build the kind of layout I did. The other big influences was the guy who's in Texas who does these domino things. And I met him and we had long conversations at an OPSIG thing at one of the NMRA conventions, maybe in Long Beach in 96 or so. Anyway, and that had a big influence on, I laid out my kind of layout concept that way, although it isn't in modules, but it kind of looked very similar to what he did. So those two things, in doing the research, I got involved with a guy doing research in Southern California packing houses, and that's what really got me going on the track. So when the layout opportunity came up, that was why I went that direction. So yeah, I sure did. I had that all kind of done, even many of the buildings built before I moved up here.
David Barrow.
David Barrow, that's the guy. Right.
Yeah. Well, it's clear you had started with a lot of background information that you knew you wanted to capture. And I hadn't thought about the connection with Barrow and his dominoes, but you do capture that concept of the layout design elements kind of strung end to end.
Right.
But you don't see it as such. You just feel like you're going around the loop there in Southern California.
He does it in a different way, but yeah, I had that room, and he could have designed it like a spiral, but yeah, that was why I laid it out that way. It was very much influenced by David's work.
Bill, Jake here. I don't know if you showed a layout track plan. I didn't remember seeing it.
I have a
picture of that.
Yeah.
You have 3 peninsulas with a turn back.
The yard is 36 wide, and the next peninsula is 72 inches wide with a divider down the middle. So the radius is about 34, 33. It depends on the peninsula, but I wish it was 36. I had to do a lot of work on my Walters cars to get them to work well on that curvature, but they work pretty well now.
It's an interesting concept because it eliminates the duck under or the bridge.
Yeah.
Well,
Like scenery.
Yeah, tried to capture the Southern California look to the extent that we could. Lots of palm trees and not too many fir trees. In fact, there aren't any fir trees out there. There is not a lot of great palm trees. I have to say that. There's a lot of great looking fir trees, and you got them on your layout, Lee. But the palm trees are not anywhere close to what they could be a lot better. So I made do with whatever was available commercially. I tried to use that. I tried to build a couple that somebody offered, but they were too big, too massive. They didn't really work.
But I would say when you operate on your layout, it feels like Southern California. I mean, it has that look.
Okay.
You captured it.
Yeah.
Hey, Bill, Greg Wright from Olympia. Hey, thank you very much for a great presentation and for all the times you've hosted us up there from the Olympia group up on your railroad to allow us to travel to Southern California in your world. It's been really fun. Thank you.
Well, it's been wonderful having you guys. That's certainly been one of the wonderful things about having this layout that I'll miss is hosting groups like Greg's Olympia group and people from PSMRE or the Boeing Club or so on here for operating sessions. But I get to enjoy operating sessions at other places and have a lot of good memories.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions or comments, I think we will close this out. This was a great presentation, and we certainly appreciate you doing it, Bill. So
my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you guys for hosting me.